Alrighty, so there are three main things I want to do in this video to leave us with a really nice and polished text adventure that's ready to be expanded and implemented with whatever feature you want. The first of those is to move all of our input response, all of our text creation to our actual game info area and out of our main script. And what this is going to do is let us have a lot more custom handling for whatever text we tell our game info area we want to print out, rather than trying to do it all in our main script. So I'm going to select our game info and I'm going to right click and I'm going to say save branch is seen. And for now, we'll just keep this in our main folder area, our root folder. I'm not going to make a new folder. We'll just call this game info. And so now we've got two things in our basically our UI. There's our game info area and our input area. We're also going to add a third little side panel later on. But for now, let's just do this. So I'll come into our game info scene, which we just created, and I'm going to add a script. And eventually we're going to put a lot of the things in this script that currently exist in main. So, or in our game script. Sorry, I've been calling it main, but it's really game. So if I come into our game script here, there's a couple different things that we are doing. We're doing a lot of the scroll bar handling, which is something that we are going to have to move into our game info area. So let's start with the scroll bar. I'm going to take these two onReady variables, the scroll and scroll bar, and cut those out. Move those into our game info just at the top. Paste those in. Come back into game, and I'm going to take these first two lines of our ready function where we are setting our scroll bar's length and handling the scroll bar changing. Whoops, let me copy those. And I'm going to move those into the ready function of our game info area and get rid of some of the boilerplate here. Now I'll come back into our game. Remember too, I'm going to grab this max lines remembered and max scroll length variables because those also pertain to our game info. Eventually we'll come and get our responses too. So like I said, we're really just moving a lot of things out. I'll copy and paste those two into our game info area. And what this means now is that if we want to set our max scroll or our max history, our max lines remembered, we'll have to do it on our game info scene now, but that's no big deal. We can either do it via the editor or in code. So we've moved all of our max lines remembered. We've removed all of our scroll stuff, or most of it at least. We still have more. We've got to move this handle scroll bar changed function from our game script into game info. So let's do that also. And remember, this is the function that we're connecting to in our ready function. Wherever our scroll bar changed, we're handling it here in this function, handle scroll bar change. And remember, this is just making sure that we are always, whenever we type a new line, our scroll bar goes to the bottom. Let me also delete this boilerplate down here. There we go. Alrighty, back in our game script, what else do we want to take here? Well, let's grab this delete history beyond limit. So I'm going to get rid of this function and copy it over to our game info. And that's going to cause an error because we were using that function in our game script, but that's okay. We also need to get history rows. If I go to our new game info scene, history rows is a child of that. So let's add another onReady variable. This will be onReady var history rows, and we're going to just grab history rows. So again, we are just moving things out of game. I'm also going to get rid of our history rows in here. We're moving things out of game and into our game info area. So we're letting the game info area be responsible for handling how things are displayed, which is nice. Our game script is really just responsible for connecting all the wires and letting things happen. It's not actually going to do a lot of that text processing anymore, which is nice. Okay, so now I want to move these two functions, create response and add response to game, basically all of our functionality that creates our response scenes and adds them to our scene tree into our game info scene. But before, I don't want to do that all at the same time. We're going to do it piecemeal. So let me grab this add response to game function, and I'm going to cut it out of our game script and move it into game info. And I'm going to put this near the bottom because I want this to be a private function. And I'm going to change the name and add an underscore in front of it, which is the Godot syntax for a private function. I don't want this to be called anywhere else except within our game info script. And if you add this underscore, the Godot editor will not show it in autocomplete. You can still theoretically call it from another script, but it won't pop up in autocomplete. So you'd have to be very intentional about doing that. And so this is going to add the response to our history rows, and it's going to delete history beyond limit. That also is a private function because I don't want anything else deleting history. Same with our handle scroll bar changed. So I will also add underscores in front of both of those because we don't want these being called anywhere else. And let me fix that error. Okay, so now we have a function that is going to add a response to our game, but we don't want to call it there. What we want to do instead is have a couple of nice interface functions that other scripts like our game script can call into that handle all the formatting under the hood. All our game script has to do is call the right function, pass in the text, and then our GameInfo script in here, our nice helpers are going to handle actually doing the formatting. So what I'm going to do is just kind of use some code comments to mark off this section. This is something I do a lot in my personal projects, but not always in tutorials. But I'm going to say private here. I usually use about 5 hashes. And then this is just kind of a nice visual indicator that everything below here are private functions. We don't need to worry about those. The ones I really care about, the interfaces into this class, into our GameInfo, are right up in here. And I'm going to create a new section called public. You don't have to do this. You can structure your code any way you want, but this is just going to be where we put our functions that our game scene can call into to add new text to our scene tree. So what we want to do here, and this is going to look very similar. Actually, I'll just copy in our game scene, our game script, I'll copy this create response function because that's kind of what we're going to be going for here. And I'm going to paste it into the public section of our GameInfo. And so now all of a sudden, it's our GameInfo that's responsible for creating and handling responses. And in order to fix these editor errors, we're going to have to also grab a handle onto our response scene. So if I go back to game, I'm going to take these 2 response and input response lines at the top, get rid of the extra lines there, bring this over to GameInfo, and here I'm going to just do the same thing. And normally, actually, because these are constants, they should be uppercase, but we'll be editing them a bit for now, so I won't make that change right now. Now, within our GameInfo, we can call our private add response to game function. Remember, we made it private, so I've got to add this underscore, but we're only calling it within our GameInfo script. Anything else has to call our create response function, and that's the only function that we expose to the outside world. So if we come back into our game script though, we know that there are 2 types of responses we need to show. There are ones that have a text history, which is what we're doing down here. And then there's help messages like at the start of the game where there is no input history, it's just a standalone message. And we've got to provide a way for both of those to be handled by our GameInfo. So what I'm going to do is say create response, and then I'm going to make another function that I'm just going to copy this. I'm going to say create response with input. And so in this one, not only do we need response text, we also need input text, which will also be a string. This is going to be a parameter. So this lets our game pass in, if it just wants a response, it'll just pass in the response. But if it wants to pass in some input to display, which is what's going to happen anytime the player enters a command, it'll also take in this input text. And so what we're going to do is come back to our game, and you'll see that previously we were doing all of this within our onInputTextEntered, where we're creating an input response and instancing that. But now what we're going to do is move a lot of this code into our GameInfo script. First though, let's get rid of this editor error here. First, we need to now get a reference into our GameInfo. So I'm going to make a new onReady variable, onReadyVar, GameInfo. And this is just going to be, you guessed it, GameInfo. But you'll see we're not getting any autocomplete there, and that's because the editor is throwing this error about the create response function. Well, this create response is now in our GameInfo, so we can say GameInfo.createResponse. Same down here, GameInfo.createResponse. And then here, what we can do instead now is instead of doing all this, we can say GameInfo.createResponse. And remember, we added that new create response with input function. And here we need to pass in both a response, which we're getting in line 23 right here. We're processing a command for the text that's entered. So let me move that up here. So we need to pass in a response, which is coming from our command processor. And we need to pass in the input itself, which is new text. So this is all we need to do within our game script right now. All of this creating of the actual input response, we need to let our GameInfo script handle that. So let me copy or cut this out, and we're going to move this as well into our GameInfo script. So if I come over there and I look at our create response with input, this is where we're going to need to add our input response. And remember, our input response has both our input history and our response, both of these elements. And so all we need to do, if I come back to our GameInfo script, is just remove these first 2 lines that we copied from before, because we just want to create a new input response instance, and then we want to set the text to be input text instead of new text here. So input text and our response text, which we're passing both in. And now I can get rid of this. There's a little bit of just crossed wires because of how I copied that. So sorry if it's confusing, but all we are doing here is basically copying what was previously in our game script. And instead of just using a regular response like we're doing before, we're doing our input response, which has both our response itself and our input history line. And our variable here is now input response rather than just response. So I need to change this to be input response. And now all of a sudden we have these 2 really nice, easy to use functions in our GameInfo script that our main game script can just call into. It doesn't have to worry about formatting things anymore. And because of that, our UI is now decoupled from the actual processing of the command. So our game script lets the command processor process, and then it gives its response to our GameInfo script. And it's now decoupled and it's happening separately, which makes for nicer code overall. The one last thing we need to change is, remember, I was just putting GameInfo up here as a placeholder because we weren't getting autocomplete. So I need to get the full path to that. So if I type GameInfo, we'll see it pop up. Just hit enter. Background, margin container, rows, GameInfo. So just to make sure that we've done this all correct, let's run our game and make sure it works. And if we do, we will see that there is going to be an error. And this is because when we copied over some of our onReady variable paths, we didn't actually change their paths, specifically with our scroll. So if we go to our GameInfo scene now, we'll see that we don't actually have background or margin container or rows or even GameInfo. It's just scroll. So I'm going to delete everything up to the S, and now we should be good to go. And if I run our game, all of a sudden it works. And if I type go west, we'll see that we have both our input history and the correct text being printed out. And if I say take, I don't know, sword, we'll still get an error message. So everything's still working as it was. We've made sure that our refactoring worked out. All right, now that that's working, let's get to the next part of our refactor. And first off, one thing you'll notice that's been bugging me for a while that I've never gotten around to fix is that if you look at the padding, the margin in our text, you'll see that we don't actually have any with the text that appears in our GameInfo area. First though, what I want to do is actually add a margin container to our input response. So I'm going to hit Command A or Control A and find a margin container. And I'm actually going to make this margin container be the parent. So if I right click on it, you'll find that there is a Make Scene Root button that you can hit. And I'm going to change this margin container, now that's the root, to be input response so that the name lines up. I'm going to rename our VBox container, which was previously input response, to be rows. And what this is going to do is let me come into our theme override and constants for our margin container and set a margin on the right and left of 5. And this will actually, I think really just the left we want for now. And we can adjust as needed depending on what this looks like in game. But setting this margin left is going to make sure that we don't butt up against the left side of our background. I'm also just going to come up to layout and hit full rect so that it takes up the space allotted to it. And if I change our margin to 30, we'll see that it moves it over. Let's start with, we don't need a lot of margin, but let's just start with 5. It's not a lot, but it'll be good enough for now. And you'll notice that our script is still attached to our rows object. So I'm going to clear that and then reattach it. It should just load in with the same name, our input response script, to our input response. One other thing I'm going to do is that I actually want to reuse the same scene for anything that gets printed out to the player. And we know that not everything that gets printed out is going to have this input history line here. And so what I'm going to do is actually set our input, this parameter, which is our input or our input history line. I'm going to clear it and move it to the end, and I'm going to give it a default parameter of the empty string. And so what I want to do is have a conditional check and see if input is the empty string. If the developer, the player, if there's nothing, not an actual input provided, we're just going to clear it. And toward that end, I'm actually going to save both of these onReady variables since we're using them a lot more than we were before. So I'll say onReady var input, and this is going to be input history. And I'll say onReady var response, and this is just going to be response. There we go. Sometimes the autocomplete acts up a little bit. So now I need to change these two variables here. You'll notice that actually our input as a property has the same name as our input as a parameter. So let's change both of these to be input label and then response label, just to clear it up there. So before I change these, I want to add a conditional check here to say if input equals the empty string. So if no input is passed in, I'm actually going to say input label dot queue_free. Because there's no input passed in, we don't even need to show it. Get rid of it. And because these are children of a VBox container, it'll automatically handle moving our response up to take its place, just like that. So it'll automatically handle the formatting for us. But here we want to say else if input is not empty, we will say input label dot text, and then we'll just copy in what we had down here. And now we can get rid of this line. And in a similar way, we're going to change response here to be response label dot text equals response. Okay, so now we've got one input response scene here that we can use to instantiate any text that needs to print out, whether it has input passed in or not. So if I go into GameInfo, we can actually clear our response scene that we have saved up here, and because we're just going to be using input response. And again, I mentioned this earlier, but because this is a constant, I'm actually going to change it to be all uppercase, so input response. And this is a common syntax in a ton of languages, just to say this is something that's constant. It can't be changed. And so what I'm going to do here is come down and change both of these to be input response. I'm changing this in both create response and create response with input. So I'll change it so that they both look at our input response constant. And you'll see that down in our create response with input, we are using input response.setText, which is exactly what we want to be using here. That's the function we have. And because we weren't using our input response scene up here before, we're going to need to adjust this. So this also needs to be setText. And this is a function now. So we'll say response text. And remember, we leave our input text empty here. We don't actually have to pass it in. And remember, we switched the order so response comes first and then input. So we'll need to change that down here where we have input first and then response. So we'll say response text, comma, input text. And just like that, all of a sudden now we are using the exact same input response scene to instance all of our text. And so we've got a nice, easy to use place. And we can just run our game to make sure this works and looks correctly. And if we do that, we'll get an error saying that our input response inherits from VBox container. But remember, we changed the root to a margin container. So that means we also have to change this to be margin container because it extends margin container now. Okay, so we fixed our margin container issue, but if we try and run it, we'll see that there's one more error that we get from line 10, which is that it's telling us we're trying to call a non-existent function queue_free on a null base. So this is a helpful error message that we're seeing here, but it's a little misleading because it makes it seem like the problem is calling queue_free and that function doesn't exist. Well, we know that function does exist. The real problem is that we're trying to call queue_free on something that's null. And so this is happening in line 10. So our input label is null here, and that's the real problem we need to fix. And to understand why that's happening, if we go to our GameInfo script, we'll see that we're calling response.setText where this error is being thrown before we actually add our response to the game, to the scene tree. And in our input response, our input label and response label are both onReady variables. So they don't get set to anything until the scene is readied up. And you'll see if I hover over them, it says null right now. So the problem is that we're trying to call setText before we've actually readied, before we've actually added to the scene tree our input response scene, and therefore its children scenes as well. So in GameInfo, all we have to do to fix this problem is make it so that we're adding our input response to the game before we try to set the text. And in order to do that, it's as easy as just moving our add response to game call before set text. And we'll need to do that on both of our create response and create response with input functions. So if we move add response to before we actually try to set the text, it should work now. And we can test that by if I hit Command B and run our game, all of a sudden, there we go. Our game is running. We're able to move around and it works just like we would expect. So with that, thank you so much for watching. I hope that this has been a helpful video. You've learned a bit about debugging and refactoring. If it has been helpful, a like and subscribe to support the channel are so deeply appreciated. We'd love to have you in our Discord server. Please join that in the description below. You'll find the link. We can answer your questions there. And if you do find my work helpful, you can donate me a coffee on Buy Me a Coffee. Link to that is also in the description below. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. I'll see you in the next video.